Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. Carl Jung. Have you ever felt the urge to go quiet, not out of anger, not out of strategy, but out of something deeper, something that felt almost like survival? Have you ever noticed that the more you give of yourself, the more you speak, the more you show up, the more you smooth things over and fill the silences that others leave behind, the less of yourself seems to remain at the end of the day, as though generosity were a slow leak rather than a gift? And what if that pull toward silence, toward withdrawal, toward becoming briefly unreachable, were not a retreat from life, but the only honest path back to it? Carl Jung spent much of his life asking what it costs a human being to live among other human beings. One of the answers he kept returning to was this: we construct a mask. Not out of dishonesty, not out of cowardice, but out of necessity. Jung called it the persona, a word he borrowed from the Latin term for the mask worn by actors in ancient theater, and he meant by it the face we assemble for the social world. The persona is not false exactly. It is a selection. It is the version of yourself that learned which parts of you the room could tolerate, which parts earned warmth rather than withdrawal, which parts of your complexity could be made legible to people who were not prepared or did not have time to hold all of it, and so you distilled yourself. You presented the aspects that worked, you kept the rest somewhere quieter, somewhere off stage. There is nothing wrong with having a persona. Jung never said the mask was the enemy. What he observed, with the kind of grave precision that marks his best thinking, was what happens when the mask is never removed, when there is no backstage, when the performance runs without intermission, day after day, until the actor no longer remembers the difference between the character and themselves. The mask does not only cover. Over time, and with enough repetition, it slowly replaces. Not all at once, never dramatically. It happens the way a path gets worn into a hillside, by the same footstep taken 1,000 times, until what was once a choice becomes the only route you can see. Perhaps you have been performing longer than you realize. Not performing in the sense of pretending, not in any way that feels theatrical or deliberate, but performing in the sense of being perpetually available, perpetually composed, perpetually oriented toward what is needed from you rather than what is alive in you. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this, and it is worth naming carefully, because it is not the exhaustion of doing too much. It is something more specific than that. It is the depletion of never being allowed, by others or by yourself, and this distinction matters, to stop performing. To let the line go dead. To be unreachable, not because you are unavailable, but because for a moment, mercifully, you do not exist in anyone else's story. You know what that feels like. The call you answered when every nerve in your body was asking for quiet. The question you engaged with warmly when something inside you was too tired to be warm. The silence you filled because the room needed filling, and you were the one who always knew how. And each time, something small was spent. Not stolen, spent. There is a difference. What was spent was freely given, but spent nonetheless, and not replenished, because replenishment requires exactly what you could not find: a space with no audience. There are parts of yourself that only speak in silence, parts that have no interest in being useful, no ability to perform, no readiness to be witnessed. And you have been carrying the question of what those parts have been trying to say, perhaps for months, perhaps far longer than that. We will return to that question, but not yet. Because before we can hear what those parts are saying, we need to understand more fully what it cost you to keep them quiet for so long. Imagine a village that built its whole rhythm around a well. Not a well anyone dug or maintained or gave particular thought to, simply a well that had always been there, always full, always giving. Seasons passed, children were born and grew old beside it. The village expanded outward in every direction, and at the center of everything, the well remained. No one thanked it. Gratitude requires the possibility of absence, and absence was something no one had ever considered. They assumed it the way they assumed gravity, not consciously, not unkindly, but completely. Then one autumn, the well ran low. The village did not respond with concern. It responded with offense. There were complaints about timing, about inconvenience, about all the ways the shortage had disrupted plans that had nothing to do with the well, and everything to do with what the well was expected to provide. No one asked what the well needed. The question would not have made sense to them. Wells do not need. Wells give. And the well, if wells could speak, would not have known what to ask for. It had no language for its own depletion. It had only ever known the single motion, receive from the deep and offer to the surface. The idea that it might require a season of stillness, of drawing nothing and giving nothing, of simply being a depth in the earth with no obligation attached, that idea had never been permitted to form. You have been that well. And the anger that rises in others when you finally run low is not a measure of your failure. It is a measure of how long they forgot you were alive. Jung wrote not about wells, but about something he called individuation, the lifelong, often painful process of becoming who you actually are, as distinct from who you were shaped to be. It is not a sudden awakening. It rarely begins with a discovery. More often, perhaps, individuation begins with a disappearance, a quiet, almost involuntary stepping back from the roles that have accumulated around you, the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a riverbed, slowly, imperceptibly, until one day the river no longer runs the way it was meant to run. The uncomfortable truth about individuation is that it asks you to become, for a time, unavailable to the versions of yourself that others have grown comfortable with. The reliable one, the calm one, the one who absorbs tension without complaint, the one who never lets the line go dead. These are not inventions. They were built from real parts of you, real capacities, real care. But a role, worn long enough, begins to obscure the person wearing it, and at some point, the sediment becomes the river. The mask becomes the face, not because you were weak, but because no one ever offered you the space to take it off. How many times did you silence an instinct because the room needed you calm? How many times did you feel something shifting inside you, something restless, something true, and press it back down because someone else's need was more immediate, more visible, more loud than your own? How many times did you extend a version of yourself you had already outgrown, simply because someone still needed that version to exist, and you could not bear to take that from them? How many times did you mistake your exhaustion for weakness when it was not weakness at all, when it was simply the accumulated cost of having made yourself permanently reachable to everyone, for everything, without a single interval of genuine rest? There is a face passing through your mind right now. Maybe more than one. Someone whose expectations have quietly made you smaller than you are. Not through cruelty, perhaps, but through assumption. Through the village's certainty that the well will always be full. That pattern, if it goes unnamed, will return. The face will change. The mechanism beneath it will not. There is a video linked in the pinned comment and visible on the screen right now that names that mechanism precisely, what it is, where it comes from, and why you keep finding yourself back inside it. What you're feeling in this moment is exactly the right time to watch it. But we are not finished here yet. Because here is what that face, and every face before it, may never have understood about you. That your presence was never simply convenient, it was chosen. Every time you answered, every time you stayed, every time you swallowed what you actually needed in order to keep the room comfortable, that was not weakness performing itself as strength. That was a person deciding, again and again, that connection mattered more than honesty. And the question that has perhaps never been asked of you, with any gentleness, is this: what did that cost? Becoming temporarily unreachable is not abandonment. It only feels that way because you have spent so long being the one who does not leave, the one who picks up, the one who remains. And so the first time you do not, the contrast is violent. But perhaps what looks like disappearing is, in fact, the first honest thing you have done in a long time. Not honest toward them, honest toward yourself. Because every time you said, "I'm fine," when you were not, every time you said, "Don't worry about it," when it was quietly eating you alive, every time you performed availability, you did not feel. That was a kind of lie. A compassionate one, perhaps. A lie told in the language of love, but a lie nonetheless. Constant presence soothes them. Honest absence restores you. There is a difference between leaving someone and leaving a version of yourself that was never entirely real. And it is possible, perhaps more possible than you have allowed yourself to consider, that when you go quiet, what you are actually doing is stopping the performance long enough to remember who was performing it. Imagine a painter who has spent years producing work on commission. Every canvas requested by someone else, every color chosen to suit a room she has never lived in, a taste she has never shared, a vision that is always someone else's. She is skilled, she is productive, she is, by every external measure, flourishing. And then one day she stops. Not dramatically, not in anger. She simply does not open the commissions. She sits in front of a blank canvas and does nothing. For days, perhaps. The people who depended on her work do not understand. They call it a crisis. They call it selfishness. They wait, impatiently, for her to return to what she was. But she is not in crisis. She is, for the first time in years, in conversation with herself, asking what she would paint if no one were watching, if no room needed furnishing, if the canvas belonged only to her. That question is not a small one. It may be the most important question she has ever sat with. And the answer, when it finally comes, is not just a painting, it is evidence that she still exists. You have been that painter, and the blank canvas you keep avoiding, the silence you keep filling before it can speak, is not emptiness, it is waiting. This is what Jung meant by the shadow. Not something monstrous or shameful, though it can feel that way when you first encounter it. The shadow is simply what we set aside in order to function. The anger we decided was too much. The grief we shelved because someone else needed us steady. The longing we stopped mentioning because it made others uncomfortable. Every time you made yourself available at the cost of your own interior life, something was added to that shadow. Not destroyed, not resolved. Simply set down and left in a room you stopped entering. And the shadow does not decay. It accumulates. It waits with a patience that is almost unreasonable, because it has no choice but to wait. It is part of you. It will wait as long as you do. Solitude is not emptiness. It is the room where what you left behind can finally speak. And what speaks, when you finally go still enough to hear it, is rarely what you feared. It is rarely accusation. More often it sounds like exhaustion that never got to finish expressing itself. Like a question you interrupted mid-sentence years ago. Like a version of yourself that simply wanted acknowledgement. Not from anyone else, but from you. The shadow does not ask for much. It asks only not to be abandoned again. The most neglected relationship of your life is not the one that ended. It is the one you never began, with yourself. And yet, knowing this changes almost nothing at first. That is perhaps the most disorienting part. You can understand, with full intellectual clarity, that you have been abandoning yourself. You can nod at the idea, feel its weight, even feel a kind of grief at recognizing it. And then the phone rings, or someone in the next room sounds tired, or a silence appears that you have trained yourself to fill, and you fill it. The understanding sits in one part of you, while the habit runs in another. This is not weakness. It is the shape of a pattern that was never chosen consciously, and so cannot be dissolved consciously, not by comprehension alone. Jung would say that what you are confronting here is not simply a bad habit, but something closer to an identity. The persona, that carefully constructed face you learned to present to the world, was not assembled overnight. It was built piece by piece, approval by approval, long before you had the language to question it. Each time you silenced a need in order to keep the peace, a small tile was added to the mask. Each time you answered when every cell in your body wanted to go quiet, the mask grew slightly more rigid. And here is the unsettling thing about a mask worn long enough. You do not feel it anymore. It does not chafe. It simply becomes what you believe your face to be. So the disappearance, the temporary withdrawal, the silence, the morning you stop answering before you have even asked yourself how you are, is not merely rest. It is an act of archaeology. You are not retreating. You are excavating. Imagine a city that built itself on top of an older city, as cities sometimes do, layer by layer over centuries, until no one alive remembered what lay beneath the streets. The people walk confidently. They know the layout. They know where the markets are, which roads lead out. But sometimes, when the ground shifts, something older surfaces, a foundation stone, an archway, a room with a different kind of light, and the city does not know what to do with it. It feels like an intrusion, an inconvenience. But the archaeologist knows, this older structure is not a problem to be paved over. It is a record of what came before the forgetting. It is evidence that this place was inhabited long before anyone now living arrived. You are that city, and the self that went quiet in order to be useful, the self that learned to need nothing, to feel later, to grieve efficiently and in private, that is the older structure beneath the streets. It does not surface to destabilize you. It surfaces because the ground has finally shifted enough, because you have finally gone still enough to let it. How many times did you tell yourself you would attend to that feeling later, and later never arrived? How many years passed between the moment you noticed you were disappearing and the moment you allowed yourself to say it plainly? Perhaps this is the counterintuitive thing about solitude that most descriptions miss. We speak of solitude as the absence of others, but that is only its surface condition. What solitude actually provides is the presence of yourself. A presence that cannot occur while you are performing, while you are filling silences, while you are being useful. You cannot be present to yourself and fully available to everyone else simultaneously, not for long, not without cost. The person who tries, who insists on being both perpetually accessible and somehow also whole, is running a deficit that compounds quietly until one day the account simply closes. This is not a flaw in your character. It is arithmetic, and there is something almost merciful in that framing. The exhaustion you have been carrying is not evidence of your inadequacy. It is evidence of the mathematics of a life organized entirely around others' need for your presence, at the expense of your own. Perhaps what you called selfishness, in the moments you almost let yourself stop, was never selfishness at all. Perhaps it was the only accurate thing you almost did. And so we arrive, perhaps, at the question that has been waiting beneath all the others. Not how do you explain your withdrawal to the people who depend on you. Not how do you manage the guilt of becoming briefly unavailable. Those questions, however familiar, are still organized around someone else's comfort. They are still the questions of a person who has not yet given themselves permission to rest. The question worth carrying out of this reflection is quieter than those. It is this: what would your life look like if you treated your own inner world with even half the urgency you have always brought to everyone else's? Sit with that, not to answer it immediately. The instinct to answer quickly is itself part of the pattern. Sit with it the way you would sit with something that matters, because you have spent a very long time being fluent in other people's needs. You have learned to read the silences in a room, to sense when someone is about to ask something of you, to preempt the discomfort before it becomes visible. You became, without anyone quite asking you to, a kind of emotional infrastructure, load-bearing, dependable, largely invisible in the way that walls are invisible until something goes wrong with them. And infrastructure does not get asked how it is doing. Perhaps it is time to ask. I want to say something personal here, if you will allow it. There was a period in my own life, not so long ago, when I confused my capacity to keep going with proof that I should. I could manage the weight, so I added more to it. I could absorb the noise, so I never sought the quiet. And somewhere in all that capability, I stopped being able to locate myself inside my own days. I was present everywhere, except the one place that required my presence most. It took a silence I did not choose to show me the one I should have chosen much earlier. I do not tell you this as a confession. I tell you because I think you may have lived a version of it too, and because the work of these reflections, the reason this channel exists, is the belief that thinking carefully about our own lives is not a luxury. It is the most serious thing we can do. Thank you for staying through this one. These are not easy thoughts to sit with. The fact that you did says something about you worth noticing. If something in this reflection named a pattern you recognized, the shrinking, the over-availability, the cost of a presence organized around everyone but yourself, I want to point you to the video in the pinned comment below. It goes into the specific mechanism that keeps this pattern running, why we return to it even when we can see it clearly, and what it takes to interrupt it at the root rather than just at the surface. It is the natural next step from where we are now. Before you go, I want to leave you with something to write, not for me, but for yourself, in the comments below. A short phrase, in your own voice, something like, "I am allowed to be unreachable sometimes, and that is not the same as being absent." Write it if it is true for you, or write the version that is. There is something in the act of putting it into words, even small, quiet words, that makes it slightly more real. Other people passing through this reflection may need to read what you chose to write. And if the ideas on this channel are the kind that find you somewhere useful, subscribe if you haven't. There is no dramatic promise attached to that. Only more of this, slow, careful thinking about the parts of a life most people are too busy to examine. We are a small, serious group here, and we are glad you found us. Some have told me that discovering this channel felt like finally being allowed to think at the pace they actually think. I hope it has felt something like that for you.